I am Frank Schumpert, your host, and you are listening to the Empires of History podcast, the Ottoman series, Episode 10, Part 2, A Crusade Dies at Nicopolis. If you are just now joining Empires of History podcast, I suggest listening to Part 1 of Episode 10 before diving into Part 2. Please stay tuned to the end of the show for news, other podcast recommendations, and how you can support the show. In Part 1 of Episode 10, we left off with King Sigismund launching a crusade, the culmination of years of careful planning. Buda, the capital of the Kingdom of Hungary, served as the waypoint for the contingents arriving from Western Europe. By late June 1396, the Crusaders were assembled, bringing the order of battle as 2,000 French knights, 5,000 footmen of Wallachia and Hungary, and 8,000 to 9,000 various other knights, footmen, archers, and light scouts from an assorted background, bringing the grand total to between 15,000 to 17,000 men. Sailing up the Danube River were the fleets of Venice and the Knight Hospitaller, carrying supplies and periodically raiding Ottoman outposts while on their way up to link up with the Christian army. Once in Buda, a war council was convened. Remember back in Part 1, instead of having one supreme military leader for the operation, there were 10 high-ranking nobles, with no clear commander, coming together, and any decision had to be reached via consensus. Previously, Sultan Bayezid had declared to Hungarian envoys at his court that he knew of the crusade and planned on striking in June of that year and scattering the Christian forces. Furthermore, the Sultan, via the Ulema, the Islamic ruling establishment, had declared an official jihad in response to Pope Boniface IX's announcement of a holy war. Allegedly, and I put it this way because this account was written almost 50 years later, the Thunderbolt Sultan told the Hungarian envoy, "I see your courage, and I will demonstrate courage no less than yours. Behold, I will be like lightning during the battle." However, by late June, after sending out numerous scouts, the Crusaders could find no sign of Bayezid's army, and although the fast-moving units had traveled throughout the entirety of the Balkans, there were no sightings of the Ottoman army. For the War Council, attempting to decide what to do next, this news prompted two factions to form. On the one hand were the French, who declared that the Sultan had slipped quietly away into Anatolia. Proclaiming the Sultan a coward, the French, led mostly by the young Burgundy nobleman Nevers, urged their followers to march at once into Ottoman territory and start besieging towns and pillaging enemy lands. King Sigismund, however, and his Wallachian allies were all too aware of the Sultan's thunderbolt reputation. The king tried in vain to impress upon the French, after 5 years of fighting the Ottomans, that one day Bayezid could be nowhere in sight and just as easily appear at your doorstep with no warning. Rather than marching out, it was far better, Sigismund reasoned, to stay put and force Bayezid to make the long, arduous trip up from Edirne to Buda, a journey that was over 200 kilometers long and fraught with ground tough on foraging animals. But, as it so happens in history, during a contest between Fabian avoidance and Warhawk impatience, the young punk Warhawks prevailed. A certain hot-tempered French nobleman in his 20s, after hours of debate, slammed his sword down on the table and shouted, "Though the Sultan's boast be lies, that should not keep us from doing deeds of arms and pursuing our enemies. For that is the purpose for which we all came." In July 1396, the Crusaders departed Buda with their motley crew of diverse fighters and traveled along the left bank of the Danube River. Finally, in August, the army crossed into Ottoman lands, and it seems as though the discipline of the Crusaders began to break down. Small bands of men, anywhere between 20 to 90, broke off from the main group and systematically spread terror throughout the whole region, pillaging settlements, farm homes, carrying off goods and women, They massacred Muslims wherever they found them. Indeed, the inhabitants, decades after the Crusader army had long been defeated, often remarked that there was small difference between the Akinci and the Pope's holy warriors sent to, and I'm using air quotes here, liberate them. The force arrived at what is called the Iron Gate, a natural gorge on the Danube River that forms a part of the boundary of Serbia to the south and Romania to the north, very close to the city of Oryahovo. The Crusaders used the old military tactic of constructing pontoon bridges, and in 8 days the entire army was across on the right bank of the Danube. Once fully across and assembled, the Crusaders headed for the town of Vidin, once the capital of the Bulgarian Empire, now the seat of an Ottoman province. The town was garrisoned by Christian troops, but commanded by Ottoman officers. When the army arrived, the garrison promptly surrendered and turned their Ottoman officers over to the Crusaders, who executed all 100+ of their number without so much as a thought. The War Council decided the next target would be the town of Oryahovo, located 80 kilometers away. In September, Sigismund, leading a reconnaissance ahead of the main army, arrived and met the elders outside the town gates. The elders welcomed the sight of Sigismund, who had become something of a local hero for his fight against Sultan Bayezid. They negotiated the surrender of the town over to the Crusaders on the condition that the lives and property of the inhabitants would be spared, this to include its Muslim citizens. The king agreed on the spot to their demands, but since he only had a small force of men with him, decided to hang back and wait for the rest of the army to arrive. During the night, however, things began to go awry when a group of French knights and archers arrived. Ignoring that Sigismund had already negotiated the town's surrender, they tried to storm the moat and main gate and sustain heavy casualties as a result. An enraged Sigismund confronted the leaders of the attacking force, and the French accused Sigismund and his Hungarian and Wallachian soldiers of plotting to steal all the glory for themselves. The French also insisted that since they had technically stormed the defenses, they had rights of pillage. A heated argument ensued between the king and the French when the rest of the army arrived. Outnumbered, the king watched the French knights storm the town in complete disregard of his guarantees to the inhabitants. The sources recording the event, though they are almost inevitably full of contradictions, all seem to agree that French behavior in the town of Oryahovo was nothing short of atrocious. After overrunning the town's defenses, the French spent the remainder of the day and night in an orgy of rape, murder, intoxication, and thievery. Every home was ransacked, livestock slaughtered, for no other reason than to multiply the misery they'd leave in their wake. Women hid where they could, the French subjecting them to the terrible fate of virtual slave status in the mobile brothels which accompanied the Crusaders. Both Orthodox Christian and Muslim men and young boys were ruthlessly hunted down and killed without mercy. The actions by the French caused outrage in the rest of the Crusader camp. The German, Aragon, and Castile contingents, angry at not having a place on the War Council already, then threatened to abandon the crusade altogether. The French, for their part, accused everyone, and I mean everybody, of cowardice and plotting to rob them and the King of France the glory that was their right. The Crusaders then left Oryahovo, now reduced to a moaning hulk of rubble behind them, and on September the 12th, 1396, arrived at the city of Nicopolis. Nicopolis then, as it is now, is located in northern Bulgaria, along the right bank of the Danube River. It is situated in a naturally defensive position from the perspective of an attacking army, with steep chalky hills in every direction, plus numerous marshlands on its outskirts. First a Byzantine, then later Bulgarian strongpoint just 2 kilometers from the mouth of the important Osman River, which poured into the Danube, The city was almost perfectly in the strategic center of the Balkans, and a vitally important logistical junction for any army campaigning. Nicopolis fell into Ottoman hands during the reign of Sultan Murad I, but changed hands since frequently. The Ottomans under Bayezid had managed to take and hold the city since 1391, and constructed new defensive barriers. The Ottoman governor of Nicopolis, the wise Dogan Bey, in the weeks previous, and acting upon news of the Crusaders' approach, had made sure to reinforce the garrison, as well as stock the city with ample supplies in preparation of a certain siege. Also arriving outside the gates of Nicopolis days before the Crusaders were small bands of the survivors of the French sack of Oryahovo. Dogan Bey soon learned not only of French atrocities committed against Muslim and Orthodox Christian, but also learned a detailed account of the Crusader force itself, its composition, fractured leadership, impulsive French knights, and deadly Hungarian and Wallachian troops. When the Crusader army showed up outside the gates, Dogan Bey passed along this vital intelligence to the Sultan. The war council was called, and Sigismund made no qualms about reminding the Crusaders of why he wanted to take his time in Buda and build proper siege equipment at the very least. The king pointed out that the city was so well fortified, and he argued for the Crusaders to bypass the city altogether and seek more defensible ground from which to send out long-range raiding parties and scouts in order to locate Bayezid's army. Bayezid, King Sigismund lectured the council, was no fool and could easily slip past scouting parties and arrive just over the horizon. The French knights, as always, argued for a direct assault against the fortress immediately, but with Wallachian and German leadership now on the war council, the French found themselves outvoted as far as a direct attack was concerned. Instead, both sides decided to split the difference. The Crusaders would blockade Nicopolis, bringing up the Venetian ships from the Danube for supplies as well as to shut off support from the river. Next, they would heed Sigismund's call for scouts to be sent in all directions to locate Bayezid's army. The next 2 weeks, with Nicopolis blockaded and the scouts unable to locate Bayezid, Sigismund grew worried, to the point that a deep depression seemed to overtake him, and he became sullen and withdrawn. The French knights passed the days mostly drunk and engaged in various sports enjoyed by their class. The daily marshalling of troops for readiness, long a tradition of medieval expeditionary armies, were abandoned as the discipline slowly evaporated. Although the Crusaders weren't aware of it, the Ottomans were passing through Edirne, probably around the time Nicopolis settled down to wait the siege out. The Sultan was heading at full speed for the Sipahi Pass, the site of much bloodletting between Ottoman and Russian armies during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877–78. Arriving outside the pass, the Sultan drew up his army. Joining him was Prince Stefan Lazar of Moravian Serbia, with over 1,000 mounted knights. The prince had been a reliable vassal of the Sultan, since being spared after his capture during the Battle of Kosovo. Plus, the Sultan recognized him as a legitimate ruler and supported the prince whenever he could. Prince Lazar's men didn't need much of a pep talk to get geared up to fight the Crusaders. News of the atrocities against the Orthodox Christians were spreading like wildfire. In mid-September, the Sultan headed straight to Nicopolis. Historians put his order of battle as something like 6,000 Janissaries, evidence that the corps expanded rapidly during his reign. 3,000 elite cavalry, the Sipahi, and anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 Akinci raiders, and the addition of Prince Lazar's 1,000 knights rounded out the Ottoman force. More important than troop numbers, however, were the supreme unity of command enjoyed by the Ottomans, and the ironclad discipline displayed by years of heavy training in the off-season. The Ottomans had the added advantage that most of them were veterans of Bayezid's battles, and as familiar with fighting King Sigismund as the king was with them. Although the Crusaders weren't aware of it, the Ottomans were passing through Edirne, probably around the time Nicopolis settled down to wait the siege out. The Sultan was heading at full speed for the Sipahi Pass, the site of much bloodletting between Ottoman and Russian armies, centuries later during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. Arriving outside the pass, the Sultan drew up his army. Joining him was Prince Stefan Lazar of Moravian Serbia, with over 1,000 mounted knights. The prince had been a reliable vassal of the Sultan since being spared after his capture during the Battle of Kosovo. Plus, the Sultan recognized him as the legitimate ruler and supported the prince wherever he could. Prince Lazar's men didn't need much of a pep talk to get geared up to fight the Crusaders either. News of the atrocities against the Orthodox Christians were spreading like wildfire. In mid-September, the Sultan headed straight to Nicopolis. Historians put his order of battle at something like 6,000 Janissaries, evidence that the corps experienced a rapid expansion during his reign, 3,000 elite cavalry, the Sipahi, and anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 encamp raiders, and the addition of Prince Lazar's 1,000 knights rounded out the Ottoman force. More important than troop numbers, however, were the supreme unity of command enjoyed by the Ottomans and the ironclad discipline displayed by years of heavy fighting in the off-season. The Ottomans had the added advantage that most of them were veterans of Bayezid's battles, and as familiar with fighting King Sigismund as the king was them. King Sigismund's scouts on September the 23rd had finally spotted the Ottomans bearing down on them about 70 kilometers up the Danube River south of Nicopolis. Despite this news, the War Council was slow to gather, and it wasn't unbelievably so until the next day, the 24th, did the leaders assemble and decide what to do. The haughty French nobleman, Balsacot, ordered any soldier spreading rumors of an imminent Ottoman attack to have his ears clipped off. Morale in the Crusader camp, as you can imagine, plummeted, as men were seized, tied to poles with their arms behind their backs, and mutilated for having done no greater an offense than repeating stories told of the ferocious Turks learned while scouting or foraging for food. Meanwhile, the War Council attempted to shake off hazy hangovers and make ready to muster their men. As usual, it was King Sigismund who cautioned wise tactics as the situation developed. He decisively put forth a plan for the Crusaders to defeat Bayezid's force based on his many years of fighting them. First, the experienced foot soldiers of the Wallachian infantry and Hungarian pikemen would advance first to meet the Ottoman vanguard, the Turkish encamp. Sigismund argued the Ottomans liked to use up the irregular raiders in battle, so as to soften and tire out enemies, and make things easier for the Sultan's Sipahi and Janissaries. Once the encamp were dispatched, the French knights would follow up the attack and focus on the Sipahi, while the rest of the Crusader forces would focus on taking out the Janissaries. Sigismund was hopeful. For the first time, the Ottomans would now be fighting on equal terms. His plan exploited the Ottoman lack of a reserve fighting force, a particular trait of Bayezid it seemed, and breaking the back of the elite Janissary corps on the battlefield. If King Sigismund could defeat Bayezid's Janissaries and scatter the Sipahi, then all of Christian Europe might be liberated. The French, of course, couldn't see the wisdom in the plan. The Marshal of Burgundy thus proclaimed when he learned that Europe's most noblest of knights, the French, would be taking up the rear of an attack led by common peasants. To take up the rear is to dishonor us and expose us to the contempt of all. With that, the knights threatened to abandon the cause and return home, unless they themselves were given the honor of leading the attack. After furious hours of argument and King Sigismund storming out of the meeting, it was agreed to follow Sigismund's plan, but with the French leading the attack, and not the more experienced Wallachian and Transylvanian troops. As Sigismund stormed out of the tent, white with rage that he had been forced to give in to yet more foolhardy demands by the French, a scout rushed up to him and reported that while the war council had been in session, the Sultan had somehow moved undetected and was a mere 5 hours away. Advance units of the Ottoman army had already been spotted in the distance, and through the misty rain were seen erecting spikes in the fields across from Nicopolis to act as a barrier to any cavalry charge. The nightmarish scenario that Sigismund had tried so desperately to avoid, that of Bayezid striking without warning and gaining the terrible initiative of surprise, was now right outside the Crusader camp. When the news was announced of the Sultan's proximity, the leaders in the war council reportedly all sprang up at once, but still sick from hangovers, some stumbled to the ground. Panic almost overtook the entire Crusader camp as half-drunken men grabbed weapons and mustered. By daybreak the next day, Turkish war drums from the Ottoman military marching bands, the Meheter, sounded across the valley. The French knights, now thoroughly sober, showed up at the head of the Crusader army, with its back now turned on Nicopolis, in full battle array. From the besieged city, the governor, Dogan Bey, and the inhabitants shouted for joy at the sight of the Sultan's army, and mocked the Crusaders in what was hilariously recorded by both Ottoman and Hungarian chroniclers as, quote, vulgar displays of nudity and obscene gestures, unquote. A sight I would have loved to have seen, it goes without saying. Leading the Crusader charge was one Deu, with the entire French knight contingent behind him, some 3,000 to 4,000 men. Citing the hated Akinci erecting spikes in the ground at the top of a hill, Deu mistook this force as the main Ottoman army and ordered a full charge. The knights cheered and charged the Akinci, causing over 500 casualties. The spikes I've been speaking of were roughly 14 feet long, sharpened poles, and arranged in an X formation and designed so as to impel the horses of cavalry charges. I'll leave it up to other podcasts specifically zeroed in on medieval warfare to elaborate further. Suffice to say that for this episode, that the spikes proved so much of an obstacle that almost half of the French knights were forced to dismount and pull them up for their comrades coming up behind them. And this really seems to have been the real point behind the spikes. Deu pursued the Ottoman force after inflicting heavy casualties, and some accounts have it that the French believed they had not defeated irregular cannon fodder, but, as I said earlier, the main Ottoman army. With shouts of victory, the knights charged up the hill, their attack having lost some of the momentum after half of them dismounted to remove the spikes. Their armor weighing and tiring them down, the French knights slowed as they slugged their way up the chalky hill, not stopping to wait for the rest of the Crusader army, who hadn't even arrived at the base of the hill yet. The French crested the hill, expecting to find a fleeing army and abandoned camp. Instead, they found, much to their horror, the main Ottoman army, fresh and ready for combat. The Sipahi cavalry of the Ottomans headed straight for the knights, and behind them, marching in step, were row after row of the iron Janissaries, advancing on the knights, to the cadence of Mehetner's bands, drums, trumpets, cymbals, and loud shouts of God is great. Confronted with total annihilation, the French knights turned tail and ran down the hill back the way they'd come as fast as they could go. Behind them, the thunderous noise of the Sipahi hoofs brought with them death, as they were cut down to a man and slaughtered. The Sipahi then peeled away in two large coordinated units to sweep around the hill and flank the remainder of the crusading forces strung out behind the doomed knights. As the French contingent was wiped out, the all-important Hungarian, Transylvanian, and Wallachian troops, arguably the best trained and experienced, weighed their options. Against the pleadings of Sigismund, the Wallachian and Transylvanian troops were led off the battlefield when their leaders came to the grim realization that the battle was lost. The Ottoman army had now reached the bottom of the hill, and as the Allied troops left the field, the Sipahi advanced with the Janissaries on the Crusaders. The Germans and Hungarian troops rushed to meet them, and they, along with King Sigismund, attempted to save the day in intense melee combat. Christian long swords meeting the battle axes of the Janissaries, the two sides fought for over 3 hours, till at last even Sigismund had to admit the jig was up. Sigismund then retreated with what was left of his bodyguard, having nearly been captured by Sipahi in the process, along with the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, and managed to make his way to a Venetian ship. The king would later remark, "We lost the day by pride and vanity of the French. If they believed my advice, we had enough men to fight our enemies." After leaving, the king exited the field of battle. The overall leadership fell to Sigismund's second in command, the Hungarian Baron Nicholas II. As a sign of the shifty loyalty the Hungarian barons would later display in the future, Nicholas immediately surrendered the Crusader army once Sigismund was out of sight. In the aftermath of the battle, Sultan Bayezid toured the field and inspected the captured Christian troops. The governor of Nicopolis, as well as the elders from Oryahovo, were at his side, inflaming the Sultan with stories of the Crusaders' brutality. On the one hand, the Sultan's Muslim troops demanded the terms of the official jihad issued by the ulama be fulfilled, and that the Christian captives pay with their blood. Meanwhile, the Christian Serbian troops, horrified upon learning the terrible fate of their captured Orthodox brothers and sisters, suffered at the hands of the Catholic Crusaders, demanded vengeance along with their Muslim comrades. The next morning, September the 26th, Bayezid ordered all the captured prisoners brought before him. As the solemn men were paraded, Bayezid suddenly recognized one of them, Jacques, a French knight who had served as a vassal during Sultan Murad's reign. He ordered him spared and to identify the chief nobles who would fetch the highest ransom. Jacques approached the assembled captives and pointed out over a dozen of the richest men of England, France, and various other European courts. The Sultan ordered that any man in good physical condition below the age of 20 were to be spared because they could prove useful in the Ottoman military. It is worth pointing out here that one of those fortunate number were Johann Schellenberger, whose fascinating life I plan on doing a brief bio in a later episode. The remaining men, poor nobles, common peasant stock, and anyone over the age of 20, were herded together in groups of 5 and 10 and all bound together. The Sultan ordered them all to be executed, and by the end of the day the bloody work had so exhausted and demoralized his erstwhile eager to punish the infidel jihadist warriors that Bayezid was forced to listen to pleas for clemency from his own men. In all told, some 4,000 prisoners were executed that day. Of the men who fled the field, few would live to make it home and tell their tale. Many attempted to swim across the Danube and make to the left bank, but drowned in the fast-moving water. The few boats in the river manned by Venetian crews were the scenes of unspeakable suffering as the survivors of the battle crowded the decks and quickly filled the vessels to capacity. The survivors then beat back other hapless souls trying to board, knocking many swimmers unconscious with the oars. The few that did manage to swim the river or board the boats faced a long journey back home through territory that had been stripped of forage by the advancing Crusader army, and then doubly by the retreat of the Hungarian, Wallachian, and Transylvanian troops. The highways weren't safe, as the dreaded Akinci could appear from nowhere, cutting them down like game. The woods, already populated by roving bands of army deserters, highwaymen, and robber gangs, were death traps just waiting on the weak and defenseless victims. Some of the ex-Crusaders joined up with the criminal gangs themselves to kidnap, raid, rob, and pillage for the rest of their days, having decided to make a new life on the road, all Mad Max-like. Count Rupert of Bavaria, one of the stragglers to arrive back in his home country, would arrive years later in rags, only to die days later from malnutrition and sickness. King Sigismund, fearing betrayal by the Wallachians, was smart enough not to attempt the overland route back to Hungary, sailed down the Danube River into the Black Sea to round the Golden Horn of Constantinople, carrying news of the Crusaders' defeat to a much disheartened Byzantine citizenry. When Bayezid heard that King Sigismund had fled the field and was sailing around the Golden Horn, he had his captives stripped of their fine armor and linen and marched, barefoot, an entire 360-kilometer trip down to Gallipoli. As the king passed through the Dardanelles, he came within 500 meters of the Gallipoli fortress, and the Sultan had the prisoners marched out naked and ordered them to dance before the passing ships in mockery of the king. The last of the prisoners' ordeal wouldn't be over until 1398, when the King of France finally paid full ransom for the Marshal of Burgundy. History calls the event the Battle of Nicopolis, or more commonly Crusade of Nicopolis. Throughout Ottoman strategic planning, the sultans had always feared uniting the whole of Europe against them in just such a military expedition. This had a leveling effect upon the execution of many a sultan's foreign policy. Always quick to use diplomacy and carefully balancing the Islamic calls to jihad with the sensibilities of their Christian subjects and powerful neighbors. Now, with Bayezid's victory, Christian Europe would pose no serious threat to the Ottomans in the form of a crusade for almost 50 years, till the Crusade of Varna in the 1440s. As news of the Crusaders' defeat reached Europe, England and France resumed their hostilities. The tiny sliver of land that was called Free Bulgaria and stubbornly remained independent from the Ottomans was finally extinguished. Even now today, there are memes floating around the internet. Just type in Empire of Bulgaria and you'll see a favorite of Bulgarian nationalists, a map of Greater Bulgaria as it existed before 1398. By 1397, Sultan Bayezid had fully consolidated his empire in Europe. Hungary's strategy of buffer states was destroyed. Wallachia was on the defensive and ready to pay tribute to keep the Akinchis out. Prince Lazar remained as loyal as ever to his sultan. Constantinople was still blockaded and almost on its knees. The victory over the Crusaders also had the sweetened benefit of drawing support from the far-flung world of Islam, flocking to the Sultan's banner to serve as Akinchi raiders. Scouts, specialized craftsmen, engineers, and shock troops swelled the ranks for future campaigns. It seemed nothing and nobody could stop the Sultan, but there was a threat growing in Central Asia that nobody at the time could have foreseen, a threat that would eventually swallow up the empire and end the Thunderbolt Sultan's illustrious career and leave the empire a hollowed-out shell. And that concludes Episode 10, Part 2, A Crusade Dies at Nicopolis. Let me apologize in advance if the episode was longer than normal. While researching the Crusade of Nicopolis and then writing the episodes, Part 1 and 2, I was amazed at just how much the project bloomed. Believe me when I say we've only scratched the surface of this particular crusade and the military, economic, and strategic implications it had for the region. In the next episodes, Sultan Bayezid is going to meet his greatest foe, one far more cleverer, powerful, and crueler than any foe previously faced. In the dusty plains of Anatolia, the Thunderbolt will meet his match. And for podcast recommendations, might I suggest the Cascadia podcast hosted by Ben Turbin and Jeff Wade? I'm starting off a bit in the middle with the Knights of the Golden Circle, parts 1 and 2. And believe me, gang, you'll really, really love this show. I've lived here in South Carolina my entire life, and I do recall hearing about the Golden Circle way back when I was a freshman in college. As being from the South, the Golden Circle is woven into a lot of myth, legend, and whispers amongst grad students of Southern history at my old alma mater, University of South Carolina. I really enjoy these episodes, and I know you will too. So without spoiling anything, get on over there and give them a listen, and leave a review. I'm sure they'd greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider supporting the show by going to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify, and by visiting the show's website, all one word, Empiresofhistorypodcast.blueberry.net. That last part is spelled BLUBRRY.net, where you can comment and subscribe. Feel like supporting the show? You can stop in at Patreon under the show's page and make a donation. Any little bit would help. All proceeds from Patreon are poured straight back into the show in the form of purchase of books and scholarly articles on the subject matter. As usual, if you feel I can improve the show, or if you would just like to comment and drop me a line, please feel free to do so at empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Many, many thanks.